Good afternoon. My name is Sakina Moore, and I am the Program Director of the Monuments Toolkit project. On behalf of the United States Committee of the International Council of Monuments and Sites and the Monuments Toolkit project, I want to welcome you to our second webinar entitled Oppressive Monuments in the Museum Space. I would also like to thank the Mellon Foundation for their generous support, without which none of our work would be possible without their support. The United States Committee of the International Council of Monuments and Sites, or US-ICOMOS for short, is headquartered in Washington, D.C., which is the traditional territory of the Nacotchunk, Anacostan, and Piscataway people. It is not merely enough to do a land acknowledgement, but how can we support Indigenous communities into the future? With the Monuments Toolkit project, we are looking at the legacies that our societies uphold and are making the links to social injustice, health injustice, and economic injustice that these monuments have come to symbolize. We do this by uplifting stories that were ignored and untold, by inviting conversations as we get into these uncomfortable spaces. We will offer a toolkit for communities that are facing controversial monuments and monuments of oppression, whether it is removal, reinterpretation, and recontextualization. We invite you to visit www.usicomos.org to sign up to receive updates on the work that we are doing. Our next webinar, which will be on August 26th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, will be discussing the topic, protecting comfort women's memorials. Again, welcome, and I want to introduce you to William Humphrey, Program Associate for Research and Publications, who will be moderating today's webinar. Thank you and welcome.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of US-ICOMOS Monument Toolkit Team's webinar series. My name is William Humphrey, and today I'm here to moderate the conversations around museums and galleries as potential stewards of oppressive monuments or controversial works of art. There are questions such as what positions would these institutions be able to take? And are these controversial figures considered art, even if they are from the highest level of skill? These are a sample of the questions that we plan to answer during this event. The Monuments Toolkit team is proud to host this webinar in collaboration with the Valentine Museum and with the Los Angeles LAXART Gallery. Joining us today are Curator Christina Vita of the Valentine Museum, Director Hamza Walker, and Project Manager Hannah Burstein. To start, we will introduce Christina. As the Elise H. Wright Curator of General Collections at the Valentine Museum, Christina Vita is responsible for the museum objects collection, as well as the 1812 Wickham House and the Edward Valentine Sculpture Studio. Vita received her BA in History from the College of William and Mary in 2005, and an MA from the Winterthur Program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware in 2007. Vita has previous work experience in curatorial and education roles at George Washington's Mount Vernon, Windsor Historical Society, CT, and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, or Virginia Historical Society. Since 2020, she has served as the project manager for the Valentine Studio project, and is collaborating with colleagues to reinterpret the history and legacy of the lost cause mythology and the impact of public monuments on private thought and public policy. Without further ado, Here she is.
Thank you so much, William, and thank you so much to the Monuments Toolkit folks for having this conversation this afternoon. It's a pretty heavy topic for a Friday afternoon, so hope y'all are out there ready to dive in to this conversation. And I'll be talking mainly about one particular monument that we are working with here in Richmond, but I did want to start with a brief overview of the Valentine, and I'm going to try to do this where I float down here. I love this. So hopefully y'all can still see me while I'm on screen. So the Valentine Museum was established in 1892 here in Richmond, and we opened up in 1898. So we are one of the city's legacy museums, but we do interpret the entire history of the city of Richmond as well as the surrounding counties. You can see an image here from our galleries. We also have the original museum actually opened inside this home that you see before you. It's the Wickham House. It was built for John and Elizabeth Wickham between 1812 and 1814. And again, was the original museum, which opened in 1898. And this image is from our 1898 catalog, one of the middle rooms labeled the Virginia Room. In 1937, the museum worked with the city of Richmond as well as Richmond Public Schools to have this building brought to our campus. And this building is an 1830s carriage house that in 1871 was purchased by local sculptor Edward Valentine and turned into his sculpture studio. And he operated it as a sculpture studio until the 19-teens. Now, Edward Valentine is the brother of our museum's founder, and he also was our museum's first president from 1898 until he passed away in 1930. Edward Valentine himself was a prominent lost cause sculptor, sculpting many works. You see him here photographed with a bust of Robert E. Lee, but he did create many works of art of Confederate generals, also racist caricatures during his career here in Virginia from the late 1850s, again into the 19-teens. He also made sure to donate after his death, donate the remainder of his sculpture collection to the Valentine Museum. So we're one of 3 locations around the country that has not only many of these art pieces that have come directly from the artist, tools, but also his archives, as well as the structure. So we are grateful, but also realize that this is a really complex person to unpack, complex topics that he was sculpting about, particularly now in the 20th and into the 21st century. So what you're looking at right now was a photo that I took in 2020 of the interior of the sculpture studio. That space has served from 1937 as served with many functions. It's been a lecture hall, it's been an active sculpture studio. It has also been an exhibition space, and the most recent exhibition was finalized in 2003. So what you're looking down on now, not from the visitor's perspective, but more from a bird's eye view, is really what that space looked like from 2003 until 2020. 2020, obviously the pandemic started. We closed in March of 2020, but by June of 2020, the social justice protests here in Richmond really had us here at the museum taking a hard look at the way that we interpreted that space and the objects it contained. And so we decided to not reopen the sculpture studio to the public when our museum reopened in June of 2020. At that point, we committed to reinterpreting that space, working with a committee of scholars I'll talk about in a moment, and really working both at the board level, the leadership level, and then also with our colleagues around the city to try to receive the statue of Jefferson Davis that had been pulled down from Monument Avenue. I'm going to jump 2 years real quick just to give you guys an image of what I'm talking about before I talk about it even more in depth. But last month, we did finally receive on loan from the Black History Museum and Cultural Center of Virginia the statue of Jefferson Davis that was sculpted by Edward Valentine. That connection has been important for the Valentine Museum for many years. Certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, Edward Valentine was highlighted here in Richmond as a lost cause sculptor. People associated that in a positive way, particularly during the centennial of the Civil War. And they wanted to make that connection, that through line from our museum's founding through the Confederacy. And here you see a photograph of Edward Valentine with the bust of Jefferson Davis that he crafted. That piece is actually also in our collection. Oh, well, I got my slides out of order here. We have the caliper measurements that Edward Valentine took of Jefferson Davis's face. You're seeing that archival image here, along with the plaster bust that he created. We also have Valentine's writings about the monument that was erected on Monument Avenue in 1907. I'll show you a letter that he was writing to a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the main fundraisers. This letter's from 1904, 3 years before the monument was unveiled to the public. And he writes, "I am striving to bring to light historic truth first, then artistic beauty. I may not be as eminently successful in the latter as I would like, but I insist that that monument, that design, shall be an object lesson without an historic flaw." He scratches that out and writes mistake. He wants it to be trustworthy in its inscriptions and symbolism. Any departure from actual fact would render it as useless as a memorial, pitifully worthless. I find this intriguing because the Jefferson Davis Monument has become known in Richmond as the most lost cause of the monuments, the most propagandic piece that it really was trying to perpetuate a misinformation campaign. We have other archival sources about this monument, additional designs that were considered and discarded by both Valentine and the UBC. One showing Valentine seated, showing Jefferson Davis seated within the monument space. And then we also have photographs from Valentine's studio. While you see here, this is the clay version of the Davis Monument before the design was finalized. We have here installation photographs, unveiling photographs, and then of course showing how the monument was used over the 20th century in Richmond. These pieces were a part of the community. They became sites for birthdays, like you see here, celebrating Jefferson Davis's birthday in June of 1979. Became a site of protest. This is a 1980 image showing swastikas painted on, spray painted onto the monument. And it's also a backdrop for parades. This is a Monument Ave. I'm not sure if it's the Monument Ave 10K or the Richmond Marathon, but certainly has been the backdrop for many sort of a cultural experience here in Richmond. But because of this connection, we've been paying quite a bit of attention to this particular monument. Really in 2015, after the Charleston the murders at Mother Emanuel Church there, we requested from the city that this monument be transferred to the Valentine. In 2017, after Charlottesville, we again requested that this statue at least be transferred to the Valentine. Even after 2018, when Richmond's Monument Avenue Commission suggested that this monument be the one that was removed, we suggested that it be transferred to the Valentine Museum. And it was not until June of 2020 when it began to be a more prominent site of protest during the social justice protests here. And you see an image. This is from June 4th of 2020. This image is from June 6th, showing an application of pink latex paint to the monument and the statue. And then subsequently, it was pulled down by protesters using a length of rope and a small sedan on June 10th, 2020. And really seeing how the city, this was not the first monument that was pulled down in Richmond. There was another Edward Valentine piece that was pulled down Hannah and Hamza are going to talk about that one later. The Williams Carter Williams Wickham statue was pulled down from Monroe Park, and as well as a Christopher Columbus statue was pulled down in another location. This was the third one to come down, and was also, I think we, even after it was pulled down, hoped that we could sort of immediately have it transferred to the Valentine so that we could begin to unpack the depth of its meaning and the richness. And sometimes there's good reasons for delays, and I think our community has benefited from a pause, from not having this on view for a number of years, because subsequently in July of 2020, the city of Richmond, working very closely with Team Henry Enterprises, removed all of the other monuments from Monument Avenue. So that in 2020, the bronze pieces came down here. You're looking at an image from July 1st, 2020. The first one to come down was the Stonewall Jackson monument. And then the city in August of 2020 put out an RFP. And so we fulfilled the RFP requesting the Jefferson Davis statue. And in August, I had an idea for where it would go in our galleries. Is actually where it ended up. But come September of 2020, as the city began making its sort of decisions about where things would go, ended up all being transferred to the Black History Museum. My idea was to empty the Valentine Sculpture Studio and display just the recumbent Davis as it was found on June 10th, 2020, after being pulled down by protesters, along with Valentine's recumbent Lee. Now we have the plaster version. The marble version is still at the University Chapel at Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. But to have just these two pieces in the 600 square foot sculpture studio and allow visitors to come and see these two pieces in comparison. And that is why I am not always the best decision maker. And we really decided to turn instead and listen to our community. And so in the fall of 2020, we put out a survey. We did focus groups, really opened our ears to what people wanted to hear from the Valentine Museum on this topic. And the results of our survey were really clear. People did want to know about the artistic processes that went into the creation of these lost cause sculptures, but they also wanted to know about the history of power and policies in Jim Crow Richmond. And they also wanted to know more about the history of racial oppression here in town. Folks wanted to look at objects for sure. You see 60% there. Folks wanted to look at objects. Only about 40% of the people, though, actually wanted to read labels about them. And it was through our focus groups that we got significant feedback saying, you know what, if you put those two pieces in conversation with each other, you're not going to be able to get at the history of Jim Crow in Richmond. You're not going to be able to delve into the history of racial oppression. And so with that insight, we dialed back and we found this location in our galleries, which we think is perfect. It actually situates this 2020 object. So if you think of this Jefferson Davis statue, yes, it was unveiled to the public in 1907, but now with its layers of paint, the smushed in head, the broken arm, it really is an object related to 2020. We have a couple of years distance from those social justice protests. And so it's now situated in our long-term exhibit dealing with the history of Richmond in Virginia in a more thematic way. I think this picture in particular shows the smushed in head. You can also see bits of tissue paper that are the remnants of a tissue paper noose, toilet paper noose that was put around it. Here is another example of how our visitors can get close up and really think about the dates that are inscribed. 1607, 1776, 1787, and 1861 are the dates that are embedded on this monument. Again, highlighting that lost cause mythology, that through line, the English Cavalier spirit to the Revolutionary spirit, to the all the way through up the column as it becomes more refined to the Constitution of 1787. And this is 20th century white supremacy embedded in this Jefferson Davis monument. And it's now up close and personal for our visitors to see in conversation with the rest of the history of Richmond. We also just wanted to let y'all know that we do treat it like any other loan object that would come into our collection. So we worked closely with Team Henry to have it brought to our site, had it conserved, gave it a good wash, made sure the dirt from the past 2 years in storage was removed, made sure that that paint is going to be preserved. The bronze bits that had been exposed from damage are going to be preserved, that the bronze disease wouldn't set in, and then installed it into our galleries as you now see. And we've been really grateful for our partnership with the Black History Museum. They allowed us to contextualize it, really looking at the history of the lost cause, the other monuments that were put up on Monument Avenue, the resistance to these monuments going up, both in the 1800s and in the 20th century, and then also encouraging feedback. And that's what we're doing now. We are listening to what's going on in Richmond. We want additional feedback. That feedback is going to inform our studio reinterpretation that will open in the fall of 2023 and is also going to be passed along to the Black History Museum as they decide what should happen, what the next step is for these monuments, along with the city of Richmond as they consider what's next, not only for Monument Avenue, but probably more importantly for what's going on in Shockoe Bottom, which was the center of the domestic slave trade in the 1840s. And then, of course, we're going to work very closely with our colleagues out at LAX and MoCA in LA and sort of give them some initial feedback as well. So kind of an overview for what we're doing here in Richmond with this monument. Certainly embedded within it is that story of white supremacy, but it's now wrapped in a layer of protest, and that's the story that we're choosing to focus on here, while also encouraging feedback from our visitors.
Thank you for your presentation. It was actually very fascinating to see how even in the conservation, in the display and presentation of such a controversial monument, that the staff were able to remain professional, and that it seems that you were also able to get the local community involved. So I think that was amazing. Next, I would like to introduce Director Hamza Walker of the LAXART Gallery. One moment. Director Hamza Walker is the director of the Los Angeles nonprofit art space, LAXART, and an adjunct professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Prior to joining LAX in 2016, he was the director of education and associate curator at the Renaissance Society, a non-collecting contemporary art museum in Chicago, for 22 years, where he organized numerous shows and public programming, and also wrote extensively on the field of contemporary art. His notable shows at the Renaissance Society include Suicide Narcissus from 2013, Black Is, Black Ain't from 2008, and New Video, New Europe from 2004. In addition to his work at the Renaissance Society, Walker also co-curated The Maid in LA 2016 biennial. He has won the Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement in 2014 and the prestigious Ordway Prize in 2010 for his significant impact on the field of contemporary art. And I would also like to introduce Hannah Burstein. Hannah Burstein is an arts researcher, educator, and public programmer based in LA. And she is currently working as the project manager at LAX, a contemporary nonprofit exhibition space. So I'd like to welcome you both to the webinar, and I'm looking forward to your presentations.
Thank you for having us. And it's great to share the bill with Christina, colleagues at the Valentine, who will be borrowing the Jefferson Davis sculpture that you all just heard about. And I wish that we're not nearly as far along in our plans as the Valentine. So they have stats, figures, charts, diagrams. We're still in the planning stages for an exhibition that will open in the fall, late fall of 2023. It's a co-organization with LA MoCA. And the exhibition consists of decommissioned monuments, the core of which are Confederate monuments, to be shown alongside works of contemporary art. and we've been working on the show since 2018, but a different time indeed. And so just some brief context for the exhibition. Pam and I will run through 2015, as most of you are aware, the shooting at Mother Emanuel Church by Dylan Roof prompted Bree Newsom 10 days after the shooting in June of 2015, prompted Bree Newsom to go up the flagpole of the state capitol to take down the Confederate flag. And that was the first call that enough is enough, that these things have to come down. The next slide. Took 2 years for legislation to get through the New Orleans City Council for the removal of 4 monuments. In New Orleans, it was pretty much the first to fall. And concurrent with New Orleans, Charlottesville, its city council passed legislation to take down the Robert E. Lee and the Stonewall Jackson monuments, but it was met with stiff resistance, the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017. Next slide. And in response to the Unite the Right rally, that was kind of the first big wave of removals. And so from 2017 up through 2019, 40 monuments had come down. And as I mentioned before, the idea for the exhibition came about in 2018. Now, at that time, as you can see, there was the world of monuments that we were looking at was simply 40, right, to choose from, to talk about, right? And that changed drastically with the murder of George Floyd and the protests of summer of 2020. After those events, 150 more monuments came down. And so it went from 40 to upwards of 200 monuments in a very short period of time, giving a kind of a dynamism to the exhibition, let's say. This is the team. It's myself, Bennett Simpson, who's a senior curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and the one, the only Carol Walker, internationally renowned artist. The show will take place at MoCA Geffen. The Geffen is a 40,000 square foot warehouse space that can sustain the weight of numerous bronze statues without breaking a sweat. So structurally, it's a fabulous facility to host such an exhibition. And it's also important in terms of conceiving of the exhibition. In thinking about collecting, gathering monuments, where could such a thing take place? Obviously, having them outdoors is very close to their original context. And so one of the goals of the exhibition is to decontextualize the monuments, right? So now that they've come down, to actually show them indoors on the grounds of a contemporary art museum, to hold them accountable to the present, right? And to put them directly in dialogue with works of art from living artists. And so now these are some of the monuments that we've secured, just a sampling of some of the monuments and some of the works that will be shown in the exhibition. So this pair is coming from Baltimore. It's double equestrian of Lee and Jackson, Arthur and Fraser, and to the right is the Soldier and Sailors Monument, and we will show it with the paint on. That will also be the case, obviously, with the Valentine loan. And this is a work of contemporary art by Hank Willis Thomas. For those of you familiar with the Dukes of Hazzard, this should be very familiar. I've referred to this as all evil, no Knievel. Introduction to the Dukes of Hazzard, where the car is leaping from, one situation, outrunning Boss Hogg, to another, but it's also our way of getting in the Confederate flag and the use of the Confederate flag, the place of the Confederate flag in popular culture. This piece is called Suspension of Hostilities. Obviously, the car does not successfully make its leap. And here is the Jefferson Davis monument that we'll be borrowing. We've heard a lot about that. We'll also be borrowing the allegorical figure that was atop a very tall pillar. She's referred to as the Vindicatrix, God vindicates is the slogan that was inscribed on the portion of the pillar atop which she sits or sat. So God vindicates is one of the mottos of the Confederacy. Then she was given the nickname Vindicatrix. Nona Faustine, she's an artist living in New York. She did a series of photographs called White Shoes, where she went to sites around New York City, the sites being plantations, former plantations, slave burial grounds, slave auction sites, where she photographed herself either topless or completely nude. And here she is down in the financial district, New York. She's both a slave auction site and burial ground. We're borrowing this piece from Richmond, Virginia. And this is Matthew Fontaine Murray. And we'll be borrowing both portions, the seated figure portion and the large allegorical globe component. And he was an admiral in the Confederate Navy. Here he is as a man of science. He's considered the father of modern day oceanography because of the current and tide studies that he did that are still in use for shipping channels, shipping lanes. And his beliefs that the future of North America lay in its relationship to South America. He wanted to use slave labor to extract natural resources from South America, particularly slaves of Virginia. When the slave population of Virginia got to be too high, he thought that those slaves could be used to extract mineral wealth from South and Central America, which gives a whole different meaning to the allegorical globe component. This piece. And this is Josephus Daniels. He was a newspaperman. He founded the biggest newspaper in North Carolina in the late 19th century, and used it as a platform to whip up sentiments that resulted in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. He was an avowed white supremacist, very much against Blacks having gained the right to vote. And these two also coming from Richmond. This is Williams Carter Wickham on the left, and Joseph Bryant. And in terms of display, right, a number of the pieces, I mean the Jefferson Davis piece and the Williams Carter Wickham statue will both be displayed, you know, lying down, defaced. But these pieces speaking to the afterlives of the Confederate generals, right, as they became prominent, upstanding members of their communities. And now this is a piece by Cameron Rowland called Insurance. And these are lashes used to secure cargo to the decks of ships. And there's a text component that isn't in this photograph. The text component is about Lloyd's of London and how in the 18th century, they worked out formulas for insuring slaves, which was a revolutionary idea then, and greatly, in terms of the evolution of the insurance industry, that was an important step. But it also further defined people as property. So it's also a shout out to Malcolm, no less. That piece has actually different configurations. So we'll also be borrowing the Emancipation Group from Boston. And this piece was taken down because the demeaning depiction of the Black figure, Archer Alexander, is the slave who posed for this piece, primarily because of, you know, the way that it obfuscates efforts at self-emancipation. But it turns out that Archer Alexander is also the great-grandfather of Muhammad Ali, turns out. Strange twist of fate. Monuments in the expanded field will also get these street signs from Montgomery, Alabama. And these are Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Rosa Parks Avenue. You've got to think of the South as the terrain, got the Civil War, on top of which you've then got the Civil Rights Movement, right? And it's just played out in the naming of streets and have this intersection. Jefferson Davis Avenue has since been renamed Fred Gray Avenue, Fred D. Gray, he was a prominent civil rights attorney. He was Rosa Parks' attorney. And then we'll borrow this piece from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Stephen Foster, preeminent 19th century American music composer. He wrote Camptown Races, Oh Susanna, My Old Kentucky Home, Old Black Joe. Here he is seen composing the song Uncle Ned. And Uncle Ned, he considered Uncle Ned his muse. And here he is seated atop Uncle Ned. He also wrote the music for minstrelsy shows. And this piece was taken down because of its demeaning representation of the Black figure. And we'll borrow this from Baltimore. This is Rajatani, the Supreme Court Justice responsible for the Dred Scott decision, which was, of course, the undoing of the Missouri Compromise and the catalyst for the Civil War. And this piece of contemporary art by Leonardo Drew, the series that he did of raw cotton bales in rectilinear slabs using the language of minimalism. And so we'll have one of these works. It's about 500 pounds of cotton. And to play these off of other works, these irregular geometric forms, hard, shiny, by Turquoise Dyson. So they engender the language of Afrofuturism. Hard and soft. And this work, this is a monument to the women of the Confederacy. And we'll juxtapose this piece. And if you notice the use of the pose of the wounded soldier in the arms of a woman who's his caretaker, the use of the Pietà. And now to juxtapose that statue with this series of photographs by John Henry, which is called the Stranger Fruit series. He asked mothers and sons, Black mothers and sons, to adopt the pose of the Pietà. Right. This is a very striking image of mother and son. And there are, a few dozen pieces in the series. And so we'll borrow a sample of works from that series, over a dozen of the works, and juxtapose them with that statue, right? To address the idea of who's the victim here, right? It's coming from New Orleans. This is the Battle of Liberty Place Monument, 1891, but the events that it refers to are from 1876, 1874 to 76. The Battle of Liberty Place, the White League overthrew the Reconstruction era government. Then the federal government came back in, and reinstalled the Reconstruction government. Then in 1876, the Reconstruction era government was voted out of office, kind of vindicating the White League. That's considered the Battle of Liberty Place. So they made this monument. It's the only monument, and there's an inscription on the base, which makes plain that it is a monument to white supremacy. It tells the tale of the ousting of the Reconstruction era government, they're being reinstalled, and then them being voted out of office. But it makes plain the last sentence. The national election, November 1876, recognized white supremacy in the South and gave us our state. We'd like to show this monument because of that inscription. And to juxtapose those alongside Andre Serrano's Klan series from 1990. There are 14 photographs in this series where he took portraits of the upper echelon of the Ku Klux Klan at that time. And that was the peak, probably, of Andre Serrano's notoriety. This is the photographer artist best known for the photograph Pissed Christ. He would then go on to do the Klan series, the Morgue series. Borrowing this from Houston, Texas, Spirit of the Confederacy, and that's John Guest, the director of the African American Museum in Houston. And they're the stewards of this allegorical figure. And we'll show granite elements from the bases of some of the monuments, such as this one from the Robert E. Lee statue monument from Charlottesville. And we'll show this slab in particular with this graffiti on it. This is coming from Lynchburg, Virginia. George Morgan Jones. George Morgan Jones was a real estate developer, philanthropist. He gave Randolph College, which is the steward of this statue, he gave them half of the property that the campus now occupies. When he died, his wife commissioned this statue in his honor, leading one to believe he was a Confederate general, when in fact he was just a private and a cook, apparently, in the Confederate Army. And then Martin Puryear, this work Tabernacle from 2019, it's in the Venice Biennial. And it's based on the kepi, which is the French military cap that was also worn by both Union and Confederate soldiers at the time. That piece is about 5 to 6 feet high. And this is the list of artists that will be, those are slides of pre-existing works of contemporary art, just a sampling. And now this is the list of artists that will be commissioning to make works that will respond to the legacy of slavery, the events of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and specific monuments in the exhibition, obviously. And so unlike, and this is a temporary exhibition, in a couple of instances, one in particular, one of the artists, Bethany Collins, will be transforming the granite base of one of the sculptures. We were able to take possession of one of the sculptures from Charlottesville, Stonewall Jackson, and she's making a memorial to the Patriot Association, as they were called. It was a group of formerly enslaved Black women who formed the Patriot Association and held what is acknowledged as the very first Memorial Day to honor Union soldiers who had died in a prisoner of war camp in Charleston, South Carolina. Newspaper accounts reported that the graves, it was a mass grave, was covered with flowers after a celebration that was headed up by the Patriot Association. And so Bethany Collins wants to carve hundreds and hundreds of rose petals out of a former Confederate monument base, and then display them on the ground. So that's just one example of an artist who's doing a work transforming a component of one of the monuments. But in these instances, these artists will be engaging with to make works that speak to particular monuments, but they won't. We can't, since the loan of an artwork, we're following museum protocol that Christina mentioned. They will be returned to the lenders, but this is a chance for artists to respond directly to some of the monuments.
And the last thing I'll add is just that I think it's really important to recognize that the scope of the monuments that will be on view in this exhibition are not just Confederate monuments, but from all over the country, because it's not just about the Civil War, it's about anti-Black monuments more holistically. Thank you.
Thank you both for that presentation. And I was actually, I may bring this up later during the Q&A, but I was very surprised to see how closely intertwined both performance art and contemporary art have grown in terms of protest and assessing Confederate monuments. So it's very unique. At this time, I would like to welcome back all of the guest speakers, and I would like to ask the audience for this webinar to submit their Q&A questions in the Q&A feature for Zoom. That way I can select them and then we can send them over to our guest speakers to answer.
I mean, I think I can just, I think it's interesting that both of what the panelists are working on are things that are temporary. because I think part of this conversation is it's such influx and continuing to happen in real time. And so I think in some instances, it's really hard to plan too far into the future because we don't know fully what's going to happen. And so I think the way that, you know, the Valentine is taking a lot of, is doing a lot of public engagement to determine, like, is this the most effective way that we can be working with these objects and working with them for public good. So I think it's interesting because I don't know that there's an immediate one size fits all permanent solution for these objects.
I also think the diversity that of monuments that LAX is considering, you know, bringing out to LA next year. I think that's also really important too, to show that communities across the country, across the world, really, you know, are wrestling with the depth of meaning of these pieces, the intent of their creation, and also how the communities have changed since their erection, and the meanings that are being imparted to current constituents. You know, for us here at the Valentine, we are going to be continuing to work in the monument space even after the Jefferson Davis statue goes off of hopefully goes to LA, right? And leaves here, goes to LA before it comes back to Richmond. But I do think, you know, supporting our colleagues at the Black History Museum with this disposition question will continue to be an issue not only for the city of Richmond and our community, but communities around the country. You know, do these things need to just stay in storage until there can really be some more distance? Or are there some that for sure should go into institutions? Our early returns on our surveys from 2022, you know, people really do want museums to display these, whether they're art museums or history museums. I think it's a nice dichotomy what we're doing here, right? Like, we're taking the history view, y'all are taking sort of an artistic response view, but they're huge. There's just some logistical things that take a lot of consideration that I'm not really sure the general public wraps their head around on a given base, you know, on a given day. That, like, you know, the statue of Robert E. Lee that was taken down by the Commonwealth and then gifted to the city of Richmond and subsequently to the Black History Museum. You know, there are very few places here in the community where that could be put on view indoors, so that folks aren't having to drive by it. I think that's one of the big things here in Richmond, is that so many of these monuments you had to drive by, right? You had to walk by to get to work, to get to City Hall, to get to the Capitol, and they were being imposed on the community and not sort of voluntarily being given the opportunity to visit. Here at the Valentine, you choose to walk in the door, right? You're not being forced to come here to the Valentine. You're not going to be forced to go to LAX to see this display. Whereas, you know, city supported or community supported monuments, really, you know, you're not only paying tax dollars, but also you don't have a choice. So I think it's a really interesting conversation. I know there's some questions coming in, so I will defer to you, William, but I do think we're at a really ripe time for these conversations now, 2 years since this plethora of monuments was sort of given for consideration.
Oh no, I really enjoyed the discourse, actually. That was good. And even with the Monuments Toolkit project that we've been doing at US ICOMOS, part of our project does explore the differences between, you know, spaces that you have to live with, like they've been built there, you reside there, you kind of just have to deal with it, versus experiences and presentations that you can find in other locations. So it's always important to gauge whether or not what's standing in our living environments really represents us, and asking the questions of who it was meant to represent, or the origins about why they were erected in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, in securing loans for the exhibition, we talked to a lot of different institutions and municipalities, many of which were not able to loan to the show. And I will share a singular instance. I won't name where or what, but there had been several monuments taken down. One was still on display in an institution that was publicly accessible, but the others were put in storage, and with a caveat that they be made available to anyone who would like to see them. And these were taken down after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And when we spoke to the stewards in 2021, they said that, or maybe it was even this year, 2022, that in the almost 5 years that they had been off of view, not one single person had requested to view them. So I think it's also important to recognize that putting these objects on display take a lot of time and effort and frankly money that I think is and museums are not the wealthiest of institutions. There's the majority of museums have really shoestring budgets, and so it's a balancing act of how much you want to dedicate, how much resources you want to dedicate to these objects when there's so many other stories to tell, and how can you tell other stories through these objects, and also recognizing that they're symbols that can then be adopted and be made, if nobody's going to visit these things in almost 5 years, what is really at stake here? Is it really viewing them in a public, is it really seeing them and appreciating them as works of art, or is it for some greater purpose as a symbol for something bigger, namely white supremacy?
Well, it also shifts. I think as time goes by, I'd say that gesture, the emphasis can shift off of the object, right? In terms of, okay, nobody's going to see it, and it becomes yet another thing inside of museum storage. So it, in its transition from a loaded and fraught public symbol to yet another crate in storage, if you're going to make that available for someone to view, it's like, well, why not make other works available upon request at that point, right? Which, and then it's like, that won't make sense. It's like, hey, by the way, actually, you know what I want to see? So it becomes, which can then become as it drifts, let's say, further and further into, as it accumulates more dust, right? And relative to that question, when it becomes just another stored artifact, in some sense out of view, it can then, the request to go and view it, I would say, can then become questioned, right? Alongside, well, since you don't do other works, why would you do these works? So in which case they just become off limits, period, right? The way the other works would be then, off limits. So to think of that as having perhaps a statute of limitations.
These are good observations. I wish we had more time, but I'll have to get to the viewer questions first. For the first question, Judith Ezekiel asked, she mentioned that the Jackson statue had been relocated, which was a victory of political organizing by VMI alumni that they supported, and at a cost of about $209,000, where it was then placed in front of barracks at the Virginia Museum of the Civil War and the New Market Battlefield State Historic Park. She wanted to ask that since the museum is being administered by the Virginia Military Institute, would they allow it to be properly contextualized?
It's a good question. I mean, it's more a question for them than I would say for us. I would hope so. But, one of the, at least in the case of Charlottesville, right, in terms of municipalities that put out RFPs, requests for proposals, as to what to do with these things. Charlottesville, because of the Unite the Right rally, I would say, had a much more intense mandate, let's say, right, with the city council to get rid of these things. They become toxic, right? So no matter what anyone would say about them, as being history, right? That they had come to, there were these things that, 1,000 white supremacists and neo-Nazis descended upon that town and rallied around, right? Which then becomes part of their history as artifacts, right? So getting rid of them. But they were very clear in terms of who took these monuments, that they were not to be the objects of further veneration, right? So in terms of thinking about the fate of these things, right, it isn't simply a question of, to what degree is relocation and it's like in and of itself good enough, right? Or it's simply, you're just moving it. It's still the object of veneration, right? As opposed to having some kind of guardrails, objectives about what you're trying to do in its relocation, right? Is it a question of stewardship? So what does it mean, yes, to have it up at an African-American museum, right? Completely different, in and of itself is a kind of context for it. But I would say that there's a different set of, and that it becomes a lens. The institution that has it becomes the lens through which we look at it, right? So to put this thing in front of a military museum, entirely different thing. And to do that at a time when the military has decided to rename bases, after, to take down the names of Confederate generals, is quite interesting. So, I don't think of that necessarily as a victory as much as just, it changing location, different venue. And is a plaque enough? New words. So even if they were to go up in museums, I would still say that having them up in a museum, just in and of themselves, right, without, for example, the context of a particular exhibition, but having them up as artworks in a museum, even if you were to have a didactic panel, just the gesture of putting them up in a museum, I would say, and rightfully so, could be interpreted as a form of veneration in and of itself. So to be very careful around simply taking them to museums, which of course is the point of this panel.
And I think that's an important point too for just members of the general public as a viewer, of like really engaging with the context of these objects and thinking about like, is this like, and having that curiosity to really think deeply about like, is this properly contextualized? Like, is this an appropriate place? Does this do the same? Does this fill the same function as it did in its previous place? And I think like that having exhibitions like monuments, like displaying the Jefferson Davis monument at the Valentine with the context of this question of monuments as symbols, really gives the general public, the viewer, the power to determine that for themselves.
Right. Now, I will go one step further, actually, and say, okay, if we think of these things as radioactive, right? Now, if you're going to have an object in the museum that requires that kind of contextualization, then I would say it might radicalize the approach towards other objects in the museum. It's like, well, what about this thing? It's like, well, what about that painting over there? Right? It's like, what is there? Does that one contain any hidden secrets I need to know about? so just have it be a two-way street, right? That what this stands to do, if you're going to do that, could be, it's a serious step, but one that I would hope would have an impact on, just like with the issue about the thing in the crate, right? Okay, if this thing becomes another object in the museum, then does this then affect how you have to contextualize other things, many of which have the same kind of hidden narratives, hidden and not so hidden, implicit, explicit.
Did you have anything you'd like to add, Christina? Or
no, my colleagues look fantastic. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you both for your responses there. For the next question, Vincent DeForest had asked, what other types of artistic expressions are being considered? I guess I'm going to interpret this as him asking, in relation to what was mentioned before as declassified Confederate monuments or oppressive monuments, or if you were to put in an exhibit any of these structures, in what ways would you be able to express their significance, the full narrative of what they had stood for, and how can you relay that to your visitors?
That's the work of the work of putting together exhibitions. What other kinds of objects are they in proximity to, right? How are they displayed? Are they upright? Are they laying down on the ground? So the question of, we'll have, some of them have been graffitied, paint bombed, in which case they become much more artifacts speaking to the present moment, right? And I'm going to speak out this from a curatorial vantage point, and not necessarily one of simply museum didactics, right? So you can put all the text you want. I mean, in this kind of exhibition that, there's going to have to be a handout takeaway every 40 feet, for visitors, right? That tells the full story, the whole story, the real story. But in terms of creating a dialogue between works, right? So for example, what happens when you have monuments, let's say, for example, ones that haven't been defaced, right? Alongside of slabs of the dismantled bases in slabs of stone, right? Now, museologically, when you read chunks of stone, that's just like archaeology, right? And the fact that it is a section of something. So I think that what it does is it suddenly pushes the statues back in time, right? So questions around who made these things, right? So they aren't so much of this present, right? But belong to another era when they're shown alongside of their dismantled bases, right? That turn the thing into some kind of archaeological display, right? So we're interested in playing with that kind of shift in registers, right, of time, right? Again, through the proximity of what these statues are shown alongside. That's very different, for example, than taking the Confederate memorial to Confederate women and showing it alongside contemporary photographs, of Black mothers and sons, right? As a different kind of dialogue. So those are just kind of curatorial sleights of hand, I would say, in terms of how they create in ways that aren't didactic or through text, but simply through the means of display, right? That you can create, again, say sleights of hand, compare and contrast, or without knowing it at an almost unconscious level, a way of encountering or engaging with this object. Again, that doesn't simply rely on textual narratives.
I think the visual elements are so critical here. It's something that we've been exploring a lot as we are reinterpreting the studio. And it is basically that people don't read labels, and that is just fine.
Yeah.
And they just don't. And that is great. We're glad they've come in the building. Like, they've made a choice to come, and they are in conversation with people. Maybe there's family members around, maybe they have small children, maybe they have, maybe it's a first date or whatever, but people are coming, they're coming to us, and there's so many other things going on around them, even just while they're visiting us. So infrequently is it one person walking in and like reading all of the labels, right? And if you are if everybody on this webinar are those visitors, like, good for you. I appreciate you, but I also appreciate the people that come in and just want to see cool stuff. And so I think we do have to be really, really careful about how these objects are displayed. I think in particular with Jefferson Davis statue, right? It's surrounded by all of these other objects. In 2018, the Valentine opened a rapid response exhibit after after Charlottesville opened up in January 2018, that detailed the history of all of Richmond's monuments, not just the Confederate monuments. And when you look at the totality of Richmond's public statuary that has sort of a memorial gesture, so many of them do not relate to the Confederacy and are not on Monument Avenue. And so being able to situate those Confederate pieces and lost cause pieces in that context, in one space, being able to look around and see monuments to the Revolution, monuments to Maggie Walker, right? So there are having that sort of visual envelope that people walk into. Clearly, it prioritizes sighted visitors. I'm well aware, and that is will continue to be an ongoing issue for art museums and history museums. But I do think that thinking about other artistic expressions, almost everything is art, can be art nowadays too, and we just need to be really careful about how we display things, because the visual is where our culture prioritizes, so we're geared towards that, and just need to be really careful about how things are displayed.
But I think what you were saying, Christina, is really, like, I mean, when you're in this enough to know and to be able to admit to yourself, it's like, your visitors read labels. I mean, to what extent, right? But at the same time, to make sure it's different to know that in some form, so if it isn't a label, then if it is a brochure, where what you have to say and the narrative behind this is quite, to some degree, not extensive, but, it's more than a wall text can handle to really get at the issues. But what that does psychologically, so even if people don't read it, to know that the information is there, right, is the part where I think that and to be trusting in that regard with visitors.
And I'll also just add, like, providing multiple types of engagement in the galleries and otherwise. So yes, wall text, and yes, the visual, being really intentional about curating the show and the visual impact of the objects, and also providing experiential ways for people to engage with the exhibition. So whether that's a docent or a visitor services person standing or an educator standing in the gallery, is like having facilitated conversations one-on-one, which, not most people want to come to a museum and spend time with the people they came with, but, there are those people who want to have those kinds of conversations, or providing, a lecture format, a more informal curator tour, gallery talk, a performance that's much more abstract and dealing with the themes of the show, but maybe not necessarily the content so directly, and just really being so holistic about it, and recognizing that people are going to interact with and take things away and learn in very different ways, and providing opportunities for all different kinds of learners and levels of engagement for people to view it, whether it's once or upon return.
Thank you all for that insight. For the next question, Emma Bose mentioned that removing and recontextualizing these monuments is a powerful gesture, but of course does not erase their oppressive presence and meaning. She asked, what are some strategies in terms of exhibit design, interpretation, pedagogy, or otherwise, are you employing to support visitors who may understandably find these objects triggering and upsetting?
Definitely. I mean, we're not as far along as I mentioned, as the Valentine in terms of, but as far as working with LA MoCA, which has an outstanding educational department and a full outward-facing apparatus of visitor services, engagement, gallery attendance. One of the things I'm hoping that this exhibition will do, because of its fraught subject matter, will be to reconceptualize what that relationship is between elements of the museum, from the security staff up through curatorial, right? So whatever kind of hierarchy there was before, in the case of this exhibition, that needs to be hopelessly dissolved, right? Because of the folks who are going to be on the front lines with these objects. So yes, there are the didactics, there's the K-12, the whole host of public programs which will roll out in advance of the exhibition. There's the scholarly catalog, takeaways galore in terms of handouts. But I think at the level of staffing, and again, public and outward facing staffing, that to work really intensely alongside them, right? In terms of, not just giving them the who, what, where, why, and facts surrounding, these things. But as Hannah was saying, as far as learners, different kinds of learners, to create, and I think these things are rich enough, and there are any number of ways, points of access for those who will be on the front lines with them. How can they take ownership over the exhibition, and to create enough points of access for them to feel ownership in what's on display, right? To get into it. So, because I don't think it's a situation where they're going to be, passive, let's say, right? With how they might be called upon to engage with objects and the kinds of questions that visitors would have, and to have everyone from the GAs to the security staff to perhaps be able to engage with the visitors at the level of information, anecdotes, or if there's discomfort, to diffuse it.
I'm going to echo your sentiments there, Hamza, and give some frontline examples that we've been going through here at the Valentine, and knowing in May that the Jefferson Davis statue was going to go on view in June. We really doubled down and working with our education department, who oversees our frontline staff, engaged in some additional empathy training for our front of house staff, for our leadership team. We implemented a free Wednesdays. So now, as long as the Jefferson Davis statue is on view, we're free. So that's one less sort of point of stress for our visitors who do want to come. Certainly, just that payment can be a moment of awkwardness. And now, if folks choose to come and visit us on a Wednesday, we just ask for a zip code, and if they'd like to give their email address, we'll collect that. But so it makes that entry into the museum even a little bit smoother, and then really understanding. And I think the question is mentioning sort of that folks might be triggered by these objects. Certainly, they bring their inherent values of white supremacy, but particularly here in Richmond, folks are triggered on the other side too. People that did not want to see these taken down, and then to see them on display. And so having our front of house staff, having our leadership regularly walking through the galleries, engaging with people who are standing around, that conversation is really what we're hoping for at the Valentine, and what we've had a really successful month at. We have a regularly scheduled 1 o'clock gallery tour now. So again, that's free and it's voluntary. People can choose to join in on that. That does discuss the history of white supremacy and racial oppression here in Richmond, but is coming at it from a primary source-based place, and so that people aren't seeing it as the museum's values being imparted. It's more of a discussing, this is what happened. This object, the statue, is a product of that time and that place, and it continues to have an impact in our region today, and allowing people a chance to ask questions, to push back, but know that we're coming from a place of empathy, and that this is a complex and sometimes fraught topic for a lot of people who may just be coming because it's a free day now and not even really understand why it's free anymore, and happen upon, as the questioner noted, a pretty triggering object. So I think we also are getting a lot of feedback from people who haven't been on site. It's a little easier to write your thoughts down on social media, type them out with your thumbs these days, or or call and leave a voicemail, send an email. And we're reaching out to those people. If they've left us an email address, if they've left us a phone number, we're doing our best to reach out to them, encouraging them to come have one-on-one conversations with myself, with our director, Bill Martin. We think that people talking to people is really where the future is on this topic. It's not probably going to be in a big lecture setting where hearts and minds are going to be changed. But in the conversations I've had with people who are very mad that we have this object on display, once they come and we do a walkthrough and we talk about sort of what our viewpoint is and why we think it's important to have it on view, and listen to their viewpoint and why they think it's important for it to not be on view, we're just becoming more human with each other. And that's, isn't that the purpose of museums, right? Is to engage with humanity and learn a little bit more. And so for us, I think that, that training, that empathy, I just want to make sure that I'm actually answering the point of the question, strategies. I think that interpretation, and also making sure that all levels, echoing what Hamza said, sort of all levels of the institution have been engaged prior to something like this going out on view, that it's not just a curator putting an object up and then walking away. This really was an institutional commitment from the board, from the leadership on down to our front of house staff. And I'm checking in with our front of house people on a daily basis. How's it going? Did you get a call today? Did you get any pushback today? How do you feel about that? And I think that's been really, really positive internally for our institution, and hopefully it has external ramifications as well.
And I'll also add to thinking about, yes, the frontline staff 100%, echoing what both Hamza and Christina have said, and also thinking about visitors who might have, even if they are choosing to come here, might have a really intense emotional response without necessarily being aware of that. And I think, or knowing that was coming, because what's going to be on view, it's the heavy, deep, dark history of this country and where we still are. And it's not just, past, it's present and hopefully not future, but has implications on the future. And so I think looking for opportunities to celebrate the wins that have happened so far, including I think a lot of credit often goes to, and it should in part to municipalities that make choices and politicians that make choices to bring these objects down. And also I think the activists and local people who are working to get these things down, often for decades without any recognition, well before this was a national conversation. And in the intermediate periods when it wasn't front page news anymore, including now, I think are often overlooked to a certain extent. And so how can we celebrate those people in the galleries and find those moments of levity or joy to provide alongside with the reality? Because, it's absurd and horrifying and worth celebrating when there are wins, and so making sure that those moments are available as well, in addition to everything that both Hamza and Christina have already mentioned.
Thank you all for that. And I have to move on to the last question. The final viewer submitted question is from Jenny Spreitzer of US ICOMOS. She asked, will public funding of the Civil War monuments in Richmond Cemetery be cut off? And wants to know if this has already happened.
Okay, let me unpack that a little bit there. So public funding for, there are some public Richmond cemeteries that I'm trying to be really sort of think about the Civil War monuments. So Richmond public cemeteries, thinking of Oakwood Cemetery, I mean, yes, Oakwood Cemetery is a public cemetery here in town. A Ladies Memorial Association did erect in 1870 a monument. So I do think that the cemeteries will continue to receive support. I do want to note Hollywood Cemetery is well known as Richmond's like home for Confederates, and that is still a private nonprofit. So it is an open and active cemetery, but it is a private nonprofit, so it is not funded by city donations. It's where Jefferson Davis is buried, along with many others. But yeah, I do think the cemeteries will continue to be publicly funded. On a Virginia scale, I will note that 2021 to 2020, 2021 was the first year in many decades that the Commonwealth of Virginia did not give $80,000+ to the United Daughters of the Confederacy for historic preservation of monuments and cemeteries. So that funding line has not been restored in the current governor's budget. So there are some levels of public funding that are being sort of shifted away, particularly from preservationists like the UDC and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. But again, I do think the public cemeteries here in Richmond in particular will retain their Confederate statuary. I think I answered that question. If there's more clarification, let me know. Sorry.
Okay, well, we're starting to run low on time, so we'll have to end early. But I want to again thank everyone for attending this webinar, and a huge thank you to all of our panelists for setting aside their Friday and coming here to join this discussion. I do want to speak a little bit in regards to the performing arts and contemporary works relation to this topic, but we'll have to save that for another event. Are there any final thoughts that you all have regarding what we've talked about and what we've covered?
I guess I'll just say I appreciate the opportunity to present and talk about this topic, and that there continues to be more. It feels important to just continue to talk about these things, and for organizations like US ICOMOS to create the Monuments Toolkit, and for the Valentine and LAXART and MoCA to put together exhibitions that really provide opportunities for the general public to think about these things really deeply and really change our relationship and question our relationship to these types of objects and what they mean.
I'll echo Hannah's sentiments and also just add that, you know, we don't know what the future holds, but we want to be a part of that conversation, and are really glad to have partners around the country that are embedded in this. Monuments Toolkit, Mellon Foundation, what's going on at LAX and MoCA, and then Monuments Lab as well out of Philadelphia. So I do think there's quite a bit of work that's being done, and I think there are a lot of municipalities, of culture, history, and art, professionals who are going to benefit from this level of work, and hopefully we'll be able to share around what we've learned and pitfalls to avoid for the future.
Thank you.
Did you have anything you'd like to add, Director, or not quite?
No, I'll just concur with my fellow panelists and just say thank you for having us.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. And finally, I will bring back the Director of the Monuments Toolkit, Sakina Moore, to close us out.
Again, thank you so much for being with us on this Friday afternoon. Again, I wanted to thank Hannah Burstein, Christina Vida, and Hamza Walker for being giving of your time. And again, also wanted to thank the Mellon Foundation. Without their generous support, this work would not be possible. And also wanted to thank the hard work of William Humphrey, Gilbert Correa, Miles Isolo and Destiny Hurd for all your work with the Monuments Toolkit project. Again, I would like to welcome you to sign up at www.usicomos.org to receive updates on the work that we're doing. Our next event is going to be on August 26th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and that is going to be another webinar on protecting the Comfort Women memorials. So again, this is the webinar about protecting Comfort Women memorials. And again, last but not least, as we craft webinars that are relevant to you and to actually put forth these conversations about monuments and how we interact with them, a brief survey will be distributed to those who registered for this event. Again, thank you so much again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Have a great weekend.